So I'm going to do a little bit of audience participation here. I'm from Sierra Leone. Now, put your hand up and tell me what's the first thing you think about when I say I'm from Sierra Leone. Anybody? War? Diamonds? Right. Both correct. Yes? Natural beauty. I must say, that's a biased audience member. He's Sierra Leonean. But the fact is, I heard blood, I had diamonds. We had war in Sierra Leone. It was a pretty brutal and pretty bloody one. But guess what? That was over 10 years ago. So this is the theme of my speech. Africa is changing, but the face of Africa is not changing. 10 years ago, if you turn on your TV set, you'd see images of starving African children, death and deprivation, blood and gore, death and disease. If you turn your TV on today, you see the same thing. Death and deprivation, blood and gore, mayhem. I argue that Africa's face needs to change. We need to view Africa with the reality of what Africa is now. Now, this is not just an intellectual luxury that you might choose to engage in as a pastime because one does, you do because you could. But I would argue that it is because this is very, very fundamental to understanding the evolution of the world as we go forward. Not in the biological sense, as the Harvard professor was kind enough to educate us about today, but in the economic, political, and social sense. Africa is changing. And those that do not recognize the changes that are happening in Africa will find themselves being left out in the great game of geopolitics and economics and security and stability that's going forward over the next 50 years. Now, over the past few years, I've been a political risk analyst. Now, what the heck is that? I can see some of you thinking about. Well, basically, it was my job to predict what's going to happen next in Africa. Which government is going to fall, and what would be the implications of the fall of that government? Which company is going to lose their rights to mine mineral X in some place, and what would be the implications of that? Which workers would go on strike where, and what would that mean for the supply of copper, coltan, whatever minerals, and what would that mean for the people who have invested in the shares of the companies who are going to be providing those resources? In doing that job, I had to get very deep into what it is that are the dynamics of risk in Africa, what it is that is likely to make the next strike happen, what it is that is likely to make the next coup d'etat happen, what it is that is likely to make the next change in government legislation happen. And in order to do that, I had to understand actors on a very, very micro scale. I had to put myself into their shoes. I had to use a network of resources. Call it James Bond without the Aston Martin. Now, I work in an investment fund. I help a company that manages about $1 billion of assets decide what to buy in Africa, what to pay for it, and what not to buy for. In my old job, my typical day would start with a call from an insurance underwriter. Now, Mr. Sisay, I've been asked to insure this oil rig in Nigeria. Should I? Yeah. Mr. Sisay, somebody wants to sell something to a certain Ghanaian businessman in Ghana, and I've been asked to insure the risk that he will not pay his debts. Should I? The odds are good, but the goods are odd. Don't do it. But in doing this job, I found something very arresting, which was that as I was studying my own continent, and I don't consider myself an Africa expert, by the way, I consider myself a student of Africa. In studying my own continent, I started to understand that there were fundamental changes going on that were sort of happening under the watermark, that were not being registered, that were sort of slow motion changes, but were very, very fundamental changes. Now, I started this talk about war and blood and gore and all of these sorts of things. If you turn your TV on today, you will find these things still happening in Africa. However, there are certain subtle differences that are going on the continent that are very, very fundamental. I would like to share some of these with you because the central theme of my talk is the face of Africa has to change in line with the changes that are happening in Africa. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, there was a coup in a country called Niger in Africa. I'm not sure how many people here know it. But for the first few hours after the coup, the price of oil futures on the commodity trading markets shot up through the roof. Now, why was that? Because the people who were buying and selling oil in the future, the traders in the markets in London, thought it was Nigeria. They'd never heard about the country Niger. So you could imagine what the effect was on oil prices because of this basic ignorance about Africa. There is a certain effortless condescension towards Africa and a certain fundamental misunderstanding of Africa, which I think is not just a laughing matter. It's a very, very serious thing for the evolution of global security. Now, why is that? Okay, over the last 10 or so years, the world has been focusing on security and politics and terrorism. Afghanistan, Iraq. Now, while that has been happening, the Chinese have very quietly, very, very quietly, been staking a claim on Africa's natural resources. Now, why would I care about that? Why should you care about that? Well, think about it for a second. Russia produces the majority of the gas that goes to Western Europe. As some of Russia's former satellite states have found, Russia is prepared to use energy as a foreign policy tool. Basically, Russia has been saying to some of its former satellite states, if you don't do what we want, we're going to cut off your gas supply. That's it, fini, kaput. You're going to freeze to death unless you do what we want. So it then becomes, when you view it from that perspective, who controls the natural resources that are going to be the engine of the next phase of technological and economic development across the world is a very, very fundamental issue. Do you like chocolate? Do you use a mobile phone? Well, if you do, then you should be concerned about Africa, because all of these things are fundamentally linked to Africa. China, over the last few years, has given more loans to African countries than the IMF has, or the World Bank has. 35% of China's oil comes from Africa. The United States estimates that over the next 10 to 15 years, a quarter of its total energy needs will be met by just one region of Africa, the Gulf of Guinea, which is on the west coast of Africa, where I happen to come from. So these things are fundamental. You might not think about it as you walk past and salivate past that piece of chocolate on the shop window. You might not think about it as you fill up your tank and you drive your car down the road, but eventually it will matter. China has been moving into Africa very, very, very significantly. Now, the traditional view of China's entry into Africa is that China goes in and takes resources and gets out. It's more complicated than that. For example, China owns 20% of Standard Bank. Now, this is the largest bank in Africa by assets. So China is not just taking resources, it's moving into finance. When China starts, it's with a national state-owned Chinese company coming in, offering loans to build roads, to build schools, to build this, to build that, to build that, to build that. After that, there's a second wave of Chinese invasion, which is the non-state-aligned companies coming in to set up light manufacturing plants, manufacturing, windows and fabrication works and what have you. More Chinese have gone to Africa to do business in the last 10 to 15 years than Europeans did in the last 400 years. Pretty weird statistic, isn't it? From Congo to Cameroon, from coltan to copper, the fundamentals of the engine of the global economy are now being driven by resources that come out of Africa. It's very important, whether you're into politics or not, that you take an interest in these things. A few years ago, the president of Nigeria died. He died in office. By a constitutional anomaly, his vice president could not exercise executive power. Now, I could tell you the story. Actually, I will tell you the story of that. The reason he couldn't exercise executive power is because between his wife and his personal aides, they ensured that when he was leaving the country for treatment in Saudi Arabia, he did not officially write a handover letter for his vice president. Now, because that letter wasn't there, it meant that the vice president, even though he could act as president, did not have the executive authority to execute the constitutional duties of the president. The media focused on this constitutional anomaly. What a mess, they said. What they failed to realize was that unlike Nigeria of 20 years ago, this power vacuum wasn't filled by a military coup. The problem was solved constitutionally. In November, there were elections in Côte d'Ivoire. Who's heard about Côte d'Ivoire? Few people. Who likes chocolate? Côte d'Ivoire is the world's largest producer of cocoa, which is what chocolate comes from. The election happened, and there was a dispute between who had won and who hadn't. The incumbent claimed he had won. The challenger was internationally recognized as the winner of the elections by the UN, the African Union, and everything else. We resulted in an armed standoff. That armed standoff only ended about a couple of weeks ago. The media focused on the death and destruction and same story. What the media failed to realize was that all the African countries had got together and said, you will stand down because you have lost elections. Slightly few more years earlier, the president of Guinea died in office. Who's ever heard about Guinea? Guinea is the largest producer of bauxite in the world. His death was immediately followed by a military coup. The military took over. The media focused on what the implications would be for the big mining companies that extract iron ore and copper and bauxite, not copper, bauxite, from Guinea. What the media failed to focus on was that Guinea's neighbors said to the military junta that took power in Guinea, you will organize elections and you will step down. And if you don't, we will invade you if we have to ensure that you organize elections. The reason I bring up these examples is to underline the fundamental changes that are happening in Africa. New wars are not breaking out in Africa anymore. We have Somalia, we have a couple of wars, but these are wars that have been long-standing. We're not getting new wars in Africa. The number of wars in Africa in the 90s compared to the number of wars in Africa now is stupendous. I mean, now, not that many wars. Elections, they're still flawed, yeah. We still dodged it, but we have accepted the principle of having elections. In my country, Sierra Leone, as I mentioned, you thought blood and gore. But we finished that. We had a government that was in power. We had elections. We kicked that government out. We replaced it with another one without even as much as a peep or a squeak. It is very important that we understand these changes that are happening in Africa. China is moving in. The West has taken its eye off the ball in Africa. I argue this is because of its effortless condescension towards Africans. They're always going to be what we know them to be. The Africans just don't get it. They will always take what we tell them to take when we're ready for them to take it. This is complacency. It is criminal complacency if you look at it from the perspective of geopolitical stability and security and going forward. I'll tell you a story. A Christian missionary in Africa turned to his African convert and said, John, why are you eating meat on Friday? It's Friday, John. Don't you know it's against the rules of the Lord to eat meat on Friday, John? This is a big sin in the eyes of the Lord, John. You're eating meat on Friday. John goes, no, Father, I'm not eating meat. I'm eating fish. And you compound your sin by lying. It's very, very evident, self-evident that this is meat. John says, no, sir. When you came to Africa, my name was Uboko. You poured water on my head and it called me John. So I poured water on the meat. The African is becoming more assertive. When he was just elected president in France, Nicolas Sarkozy went to Senegal and gave a speech. The one thing I took away from that speech was a sentence he came out with, which was something to the effect of, the problem with Africa is that the African has not entered history. Now, it's a bit unfortunate to say this in Bermuda, of course, but think about that for a second. Now, this is the leader of one of the major nations of the free world having this sort of opinion. it goes to show the level of condescension and misunderstanding that's happening in Africa. If you go to Africa today, you'd be surprised at what you see. Normally when you turn on your TV about Africa, it's please feed our children, please cure our diseases, please sort out our budget deficits, and please, 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 Madonna, just adopt me. Right? No, seriously, if you're listening, Madonna, if you watch TED, I mean... But Africa has moved. Africa has moved on. We had the talk from the gentleman talking about food bank. Before, it would have been, give us money, give us food to go and feed Africa. Instead, what he came and stood here and told you about was how he was using the resources inside Africa, generated locally, to solve problems inside Africa. I'll give you another interesting fact. Did you know that an African oil company, state-owned oil company, owns the largest bank in Portugal? You didn't, did you? Sonangol, which is a state-owned oil company of Angola, owns one of the largest private bank in Portugal. You're looking at the very real prospect. Oh, to add to that, just last week, the Portuguese, when they were ruling Angola, built a massive dam called the Cahora Bassa Dam. Now, Portugal is now defined as one of the pigs of Europe, which is Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, the countries that are practically going to go under if somebody doesn't come and help them with their finances. In order to raise funds to get itself out of this mess, Portugal, which had refused to hand over this dam to the Angolans as a goodwill gesture of colonialism, had insisted that it would own this dam, was forced to sell its shares in this dam for a pittance. When the global economic crisis happened, Europe found itself in a bit of a bind. When the honey was being licked around everywhere, Africa was being called backward. We couldn't borrow in the financial markets. Our banks couldn't borrow money overnight and lend it to somebody else tomorrow morning, blah, blah, blah. But guess what? That saved us because we were insulated from some of the excesses that were happening. What it meant was that Africa entered the global economic crisis, A, with lower debt, thanks to debt relief, of course, B, with better government finances, and C, most importantly, with the longest sustained period of economic growth that had been seen in any region of the world over the last 10 years. So what it means is that any Western politician now would give an arm and a leg to have the sort of public finance numbers that African countries have. Now, this is pretty perverse, isn't it? So Africa is changing. Now, let's move from economics and politics. Let's talk about security. Yes, Afghanistan. Yes, Iraq. This is where the world is looking at. We need to be secure. Whilst they took the ball of Africa, guess what Al-Qaeda did? It moved into Africa. In 2006, 2007, Ethiopia was about to invade Somalia, and the US decided it was going to help out because it didn't quite like the sorts that were hanging around in Somalia. In my old job, we said, the only thing that's going to happen here is an explosion of piracy. Don't do it. Of course, nobody listened to us. We were just a political risk consultancy. I mean, who listens to those people? However, lo and behold, we have piracy coming out of Somalia. Last week, I read somewhere that it's costing somewhere like $9 billion now for insurance companies. In the beginning, we started to try and advise European governments to pay more attention to this. And they said it's a commercial problem. The insurers should deal with it. Now, we have intelligence chiefs in Europe saying Somalia is the biggest threat to Western security, one of the biggest threats to Western security. Guess why? Because the people who are running around Somalia and who are the most powerful in Somalia are a direct affiliation of Al-Qaeda. What tends to happen, the result of this effortless condescension, is that foreign policy making towards Africa by the West tends to be what I like to call intellectually anemic. It lacks any understanding of the nuances of Africa, and because of that, it's ham-fisted and it fails to target the most important decision makers, influence groups, and interest groups that run Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, Africa is a continent of contradictions. Abject poverty is an easy bedfellow with stupendous wealth. Saintly selflessness rests very easy side by side with almost criminal selfishness. It is a plethora of paradoxes. Now, before, these signposts only mattered to the gap year student or the philandering expatriate who wanted to mate with natives and have a piss in the sun. Now, it is far more fundamental. It will define how the world goes forward. It will define who controls the global game of geopolitics over the next 50 years. And it will define who are the winners and the losers. At the moment, East and West are engaged in a delicate dance of what I call cooperative rivalry in the interests of global economic stability. But as this dance goes on, it will become very apparent that this is a zero-sum game. And when it becomes apparent that it is a zero-sum game, winners and losers would have to be chosen. And unless the world and those who have an interest, whether because of their own selflessness or utilitarianism or their own personal selfishness, understand what is happening in Africa, what the changes are that are going on in Africa, in business, in politics, in economics, you will be the losers. Ladies and gentlemen, take a second look at Africa, please. Thank you.